I'm back.
I believe we are good to go.
Good to go. Patrick, I've sent you an email on some administrative issues. Okay. Oh, I am unmuted. Good. Sorry. It's sometimes hard to transition. Okay. We are back on agenda item 19, and the board's back in session. At this time, the board will hear an update on the Forest Activities Program. This is an information item only, and no action will be taken, although the board may ask questions and provide a direction to staff. After the staff presentation, interested persons will be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board, and the board is now prepared to hear the staff presentation.
And if I may, before staff begin, I will say I think that this presentation is timely and incredibly important as we kind of work our way through what was the worst fire season in California history, with over 4 million acres burned, a truly, truly staggering number. And I think with even the recent decision by the federal government not to provide emergency funding to the state of California, as they have in the past, it becomes all the more critical that we expend our resources wisely in this sphere to make sure that while we maintain a presence, while we maintain some semblance of an assessment of what the water quality risks are, that we also are very discerning in terms of where we do spend the little resources that we have. I know in addition to Clint Snyder's work, which you've heard a lot about, we also have Adam and Rich Mole, who've been doing quite a lot of work in this sphere as well, giving trainings to not just regional board staff, but to state board staff as well on assessments and ways of kind of really making sure that whatever resources are available, they will be available to do the most good. And I think that's a lot of tough conversations. I mean, I think very often the best projects aren't necessarily the ones that are most visible. Upper watershed protection is usually critically important, but there's very limited resources to do stuff like that. And I know kind of as we move forward and as we continue to think of new ways of dealing with these issues, one of the critical pieces of the puzzle is figuring out what to do when you have structure damage. Because I think that, bring the board's experience to bear, we find that we have a decent understanding of what the chemicals are when they have impacts due to traditional fire. Very, very different suite of chemicals and very, very different risk posed by the burned debris of houses that are in these areas. And so figuring out a way to effectively address that and to mitigate that to the sense that there are resources available is something that we're going to continue to look into and look into training things. And also, I'm remiss in saying that JJ is also taking the point in terms of doing training, and he'll be a part of this presentation as well. So we've got a lot of folks working on this, trying to make sure that we spend our resources wisely and that we stay on top of these issues. Fire is not going away. It's part of the California landscape, and really the challenge is managing this in a more proactive manner as we move forward. And with that, I'll turn it over to Clint, JJ, and Angela for this presentation.
And you're right on, Patrick. Might I mention that a science journal I was reading was lamenting about how big this year was, but stated it may be the norm now. The water issues you talk about are directly in our purview, if you will, particularly not only management of the forest, but in water systems. In that, and this was shown in one of the recent fires, the fact that the water system itself, the plastic pipes, turned out after the fire to contain toxic materials. So unbelievable things happen. We're ready now for the presentation.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen real quick. All right, looks like we're ready. All right, so good afternoon, Dr. Longley, Vice Chair Ramirez, and board members. I'm Angela Wilson, a supervising engineering geologist here in the board's Reading office and the board's Forest Activities Program Manager. I'm presenting agenda item 19 today, an informational update on the Forest Activities Program. And I certainly hope it meets your expectations, Dr. Longley.
It certainly will.
So I'll be providing updates on a number of forest program related topics since my last update in October of 2019. We'll also have JJ Baum, Assistant Executive Officer from the board's Rancho Cordova office, to talk about regional wildfire planning and response activities. We're going to make sure that there's time at the end of our presentation for some discussion. So I'm going to take a step back in time 1 year to that October 2019 board meeting for a quick reminder of the wide variety of topics pertaining to the management of California's forests that we discussed. So we talked about a series of executive orders from the Brown and Newsom administrations, along with some pertinent legislation. The most impactful to the Forest Activities Program, at least so far, being Senate Bill 901. And we talked about other influences on the forestry program, like the Governor's Forest Management Task Force. We covered existing and potential permitting mechanisms for vegetation management and post-fire salvage activities. And we talked about the 2018-2019 wildfires and the various program actions taken in response to those fires. So all of the 2019 topics remained relevant, and they continue to be significant drivers of program efforts. So I'm going to continue to focus on those for this year's program update. So this round, we're going to talk about the various activities that have been undertaken in response to Senate Bill 901, including those at the state and regional water boards. We'll go over the recommendations recently produced by the Governor's Forest Management Task Force. We'll cover post-fire response in the region, including efforts undertaken both by Forest Activities Program staff in the region, but also interagency cooperative efforts to address impacts related specifically to post-fire salvage operations. And then I'll close with a discussion on some of the permitting challenges that we face, given the broad scope of forestry and fuels management in our region. So you might be growing a little bit tired of this slide since I use it every year, but scale is really important to our discussion, so just bear with me a little bit as I run through some of the numbers. So of California's 100 million acres, roughly 33 million of that are in conifer forests, shown on the map on the right in green, with the Central Valley Water Board's boundaries in blue. The pie chart is showing that about 19 million acres, or about 57% of our forested lands, are managed by the federal agencies. It's also showing that about 41% are owned by private entities, including industrial landowners, and that the remaining 2% are managed by state and local agencies. So the Central Valley region alone encompasses roughly half of the state's forested lands, or about 16 million acres. If you include oak woodlands and foothill mixed vegetation types, where some vegetation treatment activities also occur, including the utility corridor clearing we'll be talking about, the scope grows significantly. So Senate Bill 901 was signed into law in September 2018, and it's an expansive piece of legislation responding to several years of wildfires, and in particular about concerns for fuels management and utility wildfire ignitions. The image on the right in this slide was taken from the California Public Utility Commission website, and it is intended to illustrate that more than 2,000 fires were sparked by electrical equipment from 2014 through 2017. So the objective of Senate Bill 901 is to improve wildfire prevention, response, and recovery in California. It aims to do so by establishing the Catastrophic Wildfire Cost and Recovery Commission, requiring fire safety standards be developed for defensible space, establishing a wildfire resilience program to help non-industrial landowners by providing technical assistance on fuels reduction, forest health, reforestation, and the permitting process, and requiring the Forest Management Task Force to produce a report and recommendations by July 1st of this year. So digging just a little bit deeper into Senate Bill 901, there are several specific areas that impact the Forest Activities Program. There are changes to several types of activities that are conducted under the state's Forest Practice Act and rules, including 2 timber harvest plan exemptions that were modified. The small landowner exemption was expanded and now requires inspection and evaluation for reporting purposes. And the second one is the forest fire prevention exemption, which now allows limited construction of road building or limited constructions of roads, which is pretty unique to the more than 15 exemptions that are provided in the forest practice rules, and is requiring additional inspections, enforcement, evaluation, and reporting. Senate Bill 901 also expanded the requirement for CAL FIRE to monitor and report on forest practice rule exemptions annually. And then the bill addressed several wildfire-related issues relevant specifically to utility companies. In addition to regulations regarding the recovery of wildfire costs and increased penalties for violating California Public Utility Commission regulations, electric utilities are now required to prepare and submit annual wildfire mitigation plans that describe the utilities' plans and activities to prevent, combat, and respond to wildfires affecting their service territories. These wildfire mitigation plans also include vegetation management plans. And you might recall that last year during my update, Phil Crater, Assistant Deputy Director at the State Water Board's Division of Water Quality, noted that State Board is preparing to draft a permit for implementation of the utilities management plans, with implementation, inspection, and enforcement falling to the regions. At that time, Phil also provided this map last year of the utility corridors shown crisscrossing the entire state, with roughly 152,000 miles of overhead distribution lines. So from a water quality perspective, those corridors can act, in effect, like rural non-surface roads with the potential to erode and route sediment-laden stormwater runoff into our surface water bodies. There's a potential for other contaminants to be transported as well, like pesticides and herbicides. So to better understand the spatial extent of the utility corridors where vegetation management activities may occur across the Central Valley region, program staff engaged in a GIS modeling exercise last year. This map is the result of that initial effort, and it's focused on the 2 largest utilities within the region, Pacific Gas and Electric, or PG&E, and Southern California Edison. It also shows by shading the areas of designated primary responsibility for preventing and suppressing fire across the state. You'll see that as, it says LRA, FRA, SRA. Those stand for local, federal, and state responsibility areas and are shaded blue, orange, and yellow. So I'll just point out the spatial extent of the state responsibility area in particular, because it's going to be relevant later in my discussion. So there are a number of smaller utilities in the region not reflected on the map. And so I put in this table here all of the utilities that have more than 100 miles each. And then at the very bottom of that table, you see something that says 7 small utilities for all those that have less than 100 miles each, just lumped together, totaling about 12,000 miles of corridor within the Central Valley region. So the state and the regional boards did receive some resources to handle the increased workload anticipated by the passage of Senate Bill 901. The Central Valley Board received 9 positions to be split between the Forest Activities Program and the 401 Certification Program. And we also received funding for a helicopter contract to assist staff with identifying critical inspection areas in remote locations. So the 6 Forest Activities Program staff will be focused on forest practice rule exemptions, utility corridor vegetation treatment, and post-fire management activities. in addition to our core work of ensuring green tree forest activities are also covered by our general order. Staff will be conducting inspections, reviewing annual wildfire and vegetation treatment plans that the utilities prepare, and coordinating that review with State Board and the CPUC. We'll also be working with State Board on the development of their statewide permit specific to utilities and conducting necessary enforcement activities. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've learned so far. We've encountered a couple of issues, learning a lot about how the utilities operate. The review of utility right-of-way exemptions that are provided under the forest practice rules is pretty difficult for us. In fact, most of the time, we don't know exactly where or when they're operating, which makes inspection and evaluation for compliance very challenging. So just for scale, since January of 2020, roughly 440,000 acres of utility right-of-way exemptions, or about 76% of the notices statewide, have been submitted for activities in our region. The larger companies like PG&E have very complex organizational structures that we need to better understand, and the best management practices that they use are often difficult for us to obtain, and of course, as you would expect, are inconsistent between the utilities. Other agencies are involved that we haven't worked very closely with in the past in this program, including the CPUC. And we found that current permitting mechanisms for the utility vegetation management activities are a pretty poor fit. We've also learned that small landowners really don't understand the complex regulatory environment surrounding vegetation management under the forest practice rules in California. So with 6 new staff recently hired into the forest activities program and a completed statewide permit for them to implement potentially years away, we decided to spend some time developing tools. Staff created a GIS-based utility corridor prioritization model that I mentioned earlier. And the model combines utility corridor locations, proximity to watercourses, slope, and erosion hazard to identify areas of potential water quality concern. We're testing the model by ground truthing it during inspections, and we'll be revising it based on our findings. So the image in this slide is taken from that system, and it combines those standard criteria with the footprint of the Creek Fire in Fresno County, which has reached more than 322,000 acres and is now called the largest individual wildfire in the state's recorded history. So what you see is the Creek Fire here in the orange striped polygon. Watercourses are the blue lines. Utility corridors are the red lines. And the priority points that we identify based on those criteria are the red dots. So it appears based on the model that few of the main utility transmission lines and priority points have been impacted by the fire so far. So staff will be using this tool to focus their evaluations as we engage in post-fire activities in the Creek Fire burn area and helping validate our model at the same time. We have also been testing our ability to conduct effective reconnaissance inspections over large areas using our helicopter contract, as the utility corridors can be difficult to reach from the ground. So a couple of permitting actions have already come about in response to Senate Bill 901. The forest practice rule timber harvest plan exemptions I mentioned earlier, the small landowner, and the forest fire prevention exemptions that were modified in Senate Bill 901 went through the rule promulgation process at the Board of Forestry and became effective in January of 2019. The Board of Forestry is also currently evaluating the existing right-of-way exemption requirements for any necessary changes, which hopefully will include notification of when and where operations are taking place. And State Board is working towards a statewide utility permit, as Phil Crater discussed last year. So we've talked about utility corridor vegetation management, and we've talked in the past about the regional board's permitting of commercial timber harvesting activities on both federal and non-federal lands. However, the topic of vegetation management extends well beyond our timbered lands and is certainly not limited to operations with a commercial component. So with about 25% of the state's population, or 11 million people-ish, living in high or extreme fire risk areas, it's crucial we get better at managing flammable vegetation across the state. So drought conditions, low snowpack accumulation, and extreme temperature highs have been prevalent in the last decade and are expected to worsen as climate change continues to alter landscapes and our local climates. The Board of Forestry in December of 2019 finalized a vegetation treatment program, or what we call the CAL-VTP, and associated programmatic environmental impact report for vegetation management activities conducted on just over 20 million of the 31 million acres in the SRA, or State Responsibility Area. So here we see the map that similar to the one I showed earlier, only this one has the local, state, and federal responsibility areas shaded, this time gray, yellow, and green, respectively. So the CAL-VTP is intended for use by CAL FIRE, state, regional, and local agencies conducting vegetation treatment activities on that 20 million acres of the SRA. The Programmatic Environmental Impact Report is intended to provide the CEQA mechanism by which the state will contribute roughly half of the 500,000 acres per year treated goal that the administration has set. State board staff are currently in the process of developing a permit for projects conducted in compliance with the CAL-VTP. And the regional boards received the draft permit just this morning for review, and we expect potential adoption by state board in the spring of 2021. So I'm going to take a brief step back in time to 2015. Governor Brown declared an emergency that created the Tree Mortality Task Force. That group was focused on developing strategies to address tree mortality resulting from the 2012 through 2017 drought. I believe the latest estimates on tree mortality is over 160 million trees that are dead or dying across the state, but most notably in the southern Sierras, where fires have really flared up this year. Thus far, only a little over 1.4 million have been cut down. As I mentioned last year, the situation is really complicated by the fact that over the past 30 to 40 years, much of the infrastructure necessary to handle the volume of dead and dying trees no longer exists in the state. So in 2018, the Forest Management Task Force absorbed the Tree Mortality Task Force to address a broader set of goals, including those you see listed here. Expanding and improving forest management to reach that goal of 500,000 acres treated per year, minimizing regulatory barriers for prescribed fire, forest health, fuels reduction, expanding the use of prescribed fire across both public and private ownerships, increasing public education and awareness of the importance of forest health and resiliency, and encouraging capacity building in forested communities. It also included incentivizing innovations in the forest product and building industries to utilize material from forest health and fuel reduction activities. So the Forest Management Task Force has been focused on coordination among state, local, and federal entities with funding, implementation, or regulatory authority related to the management goals. And working with a variety of stakeholders, they were aimed at resolving any statewide barriers to achieving the goals. Given the broad, comprehensive nature of the task force's goals, 7 subject-based work groups were focused on topics including those you see here: restoration, regulation, prescribed fire, workforce development, and they were all supported by a science advisory panel. Further, there are 4 regional prioritization groups focused on identifying specific needs, opportunities, or barriers that are unique to the northern, southern, coastal, and eastern regions of the state. So I mentioned that Senate Bill 901 required the task force to present recommendations by July 1st of 2020. The draft recommendations contain several common themes, including sustainable funding, like small landowner grants and funding related to biomass transportation, support for projects including technical and financial assistance for small landowners, fire safe councils, local governments, etc., support for public and private cooperative projects, expanding workforce development, And there's recommendations related to material use. So typically fuels management activities, vegetation management activities produce what we consider low value wood products. So looking for ways to use those wood products, including biomass, just to make sure that there's a market for them and they can be sold perhaps commercially. There's recommendations about streamlining the regulatory permitting system, expanding education and outreach on a variety of topics, including prescribed fire, conducting emergency evacuation route assessments for higher fire risk communities, and post-fire recovery assistance teams to assist landowners with fire recovery. So it is possible that the final recommendations will result in directives regarding regulation of forest management activities, and that may prompt a need for us to evaluate existing regional board permits, including the Central Valley's board's Timberland Management General Order of waste discharge requirements that the board adopted in 2017. So I'm going to move into wildfire now, a topic that's been pretty hard to ignore this year across the state. This photo is actually of the Bobcat fire in the Angeles National Forest. It's significant. It's one of the largest in LA County's recorded history, and it's I hate to say this, but only, in comparison to the other fires, only 115,000 acres. They've got it about 90% contained. That designation is the largest in their recorded history. It's important to recognize that California has been recording fire statistics reliably since about 1932. We've got about 90 years of fire history. This week's news reports, this is also significant because this week's news reports speculate that tree branches contacting power lines may have started the fire. So last year, we covered some wildfire statistics, including that over the 5-year period from 2013 through 2018, about 5.4 million acres, or just over 5% of the state, burned in fires. Then in 2018 alone, we had about 8,500 fires that burned about 1.9 million acres, or about 2% of the state in just that 1 year. The 2018 fire season produced several extremely destructive fires in the region, including the Carr Fire here in Redding and the Camp Fire that decimated the town of Paradise in Butte County. So the Carr Fire had what we would call marginal urban interaction, with about 1,600 structures damaged or destroyed. It was ignited by a vehicle failure, mechanical failure. The Camp Fire had what we would call heavy urban interaction, consuming several rural communities in the foothills east of Chico and Butte County, ultimately destroying more than 18,000 structures and taking 86 lives, becoming California's deadliest wildfire on record. PG&E was found to be negligent in igniting the Camp Fire. So the level of urban interaction is important when planning water quality monitoring efforts, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the Carr Fire was notable in particular for a number of reasons, not only for the startling speed at which it grew, about 20,000 acres in one night, but also for the fire whirl or fire nado that developed over part of Redding. It's captured in the photo here on your left. The image on the right shows the burn perimeter, and the fire began in late July and quickly encompassed Whiskeytown Lake there in the center, both fed and drained by Clear Creek, a tributary to the Sacramento River and an important habitat for Chinook salmon. The map shows the Sacramento River as the blue line starting up at the Shasta Lake and flowing through the center of Redding. As the fire burned through West Redding, it scorched critical tributaries that feed the Sacramento River. These tributaries provide critical rearing habitat for both salmon and steelhead. In addition, 2 drinking water intakes, one for the city of Redding and one for Bella Vista, pull water from the Sacramento River from within the burn perimeter. The concern for water quality protection was heightened due to the recent drought's effects on salmon population in the area. When both fall and winter-run Chinook populations experienced significant decreases in returning numbers in local waters during 2016 and 2017. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Fisheries experts feared that the combination of sediment and chemical discharges from the burned areas to these important receiving waters could have significant consequences for Chinook survival. Cleanup of burned home sites began quickly in the Carr Fire. So as a result of the fisheries and drinking water concerns, Central Valley Water Board staff developed and implemented a surface water monitoring and assessment program to do a number of things. One, to aid in the prioritization of treatment areas, application of mitigation measures within those treatment areas, and assessing effectiveness of the mitigation measures that were deployed. To inform the public of harmful contaminant levels in drinking water supplies, and to actively pursue resources to protect and restore the most important of those surface waters. Staff assessed and prioritized areas with the highest likelihood of positive response to implementation of management measures. And we contracted with the local Western Shasta Resource Conservation District to implement sediment and erosion control mitigation work. Field work started in December of 2018, and approximately 1,100 acres received treatments, including hydroseeding, hand-applied seed and straw, and log erosion barriers. The photo in this slide shows the straw application on burned slopes adjacent to tributaries in the burned area. An effectiveness assessment study is being conducted, and initial data indicate significant reductions in sediment discharge and increased soil stability in areas that receive the sediment and erosion control treatment. Additionally, design and permitting for 8 culvert replacements in the area is complete, and construction is expected to begin shortly. Staff also conducted water quality sampling throughout the burn area, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. I just want to summarize, we really learned quite a lot through this project. We had assistance from State Board GIS specialists, and they prepared some mapping for us that helped us kind of narrow down the scope of the areas we thought were going to be at highest risk. It turned out to be fundamental in forming our action plans for the post-fire water quality impact mitigation efforts. That GIS tool has been or will be very soon deployed by State Board to support other regional boards in the wildfire response this year and in future years. We also experienced a lot of challenges with availability and timeliness of funding for mitigation actions. While successfully accessed for the Carr Fire response, funding sources from FEMA and State Water Board's cleanup and abatement account may not be available for future incidents. Expectations regarding what the Water Board's able to do outside of existing program involvement should recognize limitations on staffing and funding. And finally, time. Time is seldom on our side when fires occur late in the season. Fire season's getting longer, and some fires burn just before the start of the winter rains, like the Camp Fire, leaving very little time for implementation of best management practices or other actions to prevent sediment and pollutant mobilization. So the Camp Fire was an event set apart from the rest by the sheer amount of residential and commercial properties that were destroyed in just the first few hours, as well as its timing. The fire started in the early morning hours on November 8th and was contained about 17 days later. So as a result of that late start, much of the debris and ash had to overwinter for most of the 2018-2019 wet season. Central Valley Water Board staff and the Department of Water Resources joined efforts to fund sample collection and lab analysis with additional help from Butte County, Caltrans, and North Star Engineering. Water quality sampling started in the late fall of 2018, with the last sampling occurring in the spring of 2020 at the 10 sampling locations that are shown on this map. There are blue squares, green dots, orange dots, and yellow dots. The objective of the monitoring was similar to that of the Carr Fire, to notify agencies and the public of potential health concerns and to support our understanding and future research of post-fire water quality impacts. Along with impacts to human health, the 18,000 destroyed structures and the associated ash and debris impacted Lower Butte Creek watershed, a watershed that provides critical habitat to listed Central Valley spring run Chinook salmon and steelhead, and supplies agricultural water to thousands of acres at the valley floor. The photo on the left is a Landsat image that was taken I think it's about 5 hours after the fire ignited. So water quality monitoring occurred on both fires in targeted surface waters. Samples were analyzed for a variety of constituents, including nutrients, metals, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. The Carr Fire water quality sampling confirmed elevated turbidity throughout the burn area and elevated concentrations of aluminum and iron, although it is important to note that these metals occur naturally in soils in the watershed. The results are indicative of soil transport from stormwater runoff caused by the burn severity and a lack of vegetation to control sediment and erosion across much of the burn area. All other constituents did not show a significant change from the baseline results. Nutrient concentrations were insignificant, and no PAHs were detected at any of the monitoring locations. So our results seem to indicate that the cleanup of all of the burn structures prior to the start of the storm season mitigated many of the impacts to stormwater. The Camp Fire burned through late November, much closer to the onset of the winter season than the Carr Fire. And water quality sampling results also confirmed elevated sediment delivery throughout the burn area. The samples also showed that during minor and moderate storm events, elevated levels of metals and PAHs were detected, illustrating the importance of monitoring multiple storm events with different flow conditions, and that collecting samples during significant high flow events may be affected by dilution. Sampling also captured elevated concentrations of sulfate, bacteria, aluminum, antimony, arsenic, iron, lead, manganese, mercury, and selenium. Concentration spikes were usually associated with corresponding storm events where overland flows occurred after soil saturation, as we would expect. We're still waiting on water column and sediment toxicity results for that sampling event, the most recent sampling event. Another significant outcome of note from the Camp Fire was that the Central Valley Water Board developed a state, federal, and academia collaborative called the Emergency Water Quality Monitoring Group that aided in successful communication and collaboration across multiple agencies involved in post-fire response activities. And the water quality monitoring for both the Carr and Camp Fires taught us invaluable lessons that will help the Central Valley Water Board and other partnering agencies as we move forward developing future response to wildfires and addressing water quality impacts in the post-fire environment. So CalRecycle, in cooperation with the Office of Emergency Services, has been working with board staff and CAL FIRE to facilitate the removal of more than about 300,000 burned and damaged trees along road rights-of-way in the Camp Fire area. Trees will be removed from the rights-of-way and be processed in a variety of locations, including several facilities in the Chico area. Work is expected to begin, I think it's late November, and continue through the winter and spring. So Central Valley Water Board staff will be expediting permitting needs and dedicating staff to ensure work is conducted in a manner that's protective of water quality. So when we spoke last year, 2018 had been named the deadliest and most destructive wildfire season ever recorded in California. So fast forward to 2020, where the state currently sits at more than 4.2 million acres burned, or about 4% of the state. And a recent, but certainly not final count of more than 9,200 structures damaged or destroyed in more than 8,400 incidents, many of which are still burning. Tragically, 31 lives have already been lost in this year's fires. 2020 is now designated as the largest wildfire season since recording began. And the end of fire season is still weeks away and dependent on the weather. So of the 4.2 million acres burned so far this year, about 2 million of that are within the Central Valley region, with the August complex being the largest at over 1 million acres. It crosses 7 counties, and it is currently at about 77% containment. And the North Complex, covering over 319,000 acres, and again threatening Butte County, and where the county and CalRecycle are already contemplating expansive hazard tree removal activities. Both fires were lightning caused and have been burning for 2 months or so. In fact, I think today it's been 2 months. Air quality has been affected across nearly all of the state, impacting millions and further heightening the awareness of the fires and the issues surrounding them. While the acreage burned is astounding, and I in no way trying to diminish the impacts of the fires on the people of California, it's important to note that from a water quality perspective, fire provides critical benefits to our ecosystems. In fact, fire scientists, is what Patrick was alluding to, fire scientists estimate that prior to 1850, about 4.5 million acres burned each year, with up to somewhere around 11 million acres burning during peak years. Much of the scale of this pre-recorded fire history is attributed to burning conducted by indigenous peoples. So we've talked a little bit before that the state's Forest Practice Act and associated rules allow for the expedited ministerial permitting of a variety of non-federal projects, including emergency post-fire salvage logging activities. Another component of Senate Bill 901 elaborated on the requirement for CAL FIRE to work in conjunction with the Water Boards, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the California Geologic Survey to evaluate and report on the various types of timber harvest plan exemptions provided by the Forest Practice Act and rules, including post-fire salvage projects. So CAL FIRE selected 44 out of 272 emergency projects to evaluate, and Central Valley Water Board staff participated in field evaluations of those post-fire salvage projects selected within our region. Ultimately, the report was completed in December of 2019, and the evaluation found that 26% of projects had unacceptable outcomes for either watercourse crossings, road hydrologic disconnection, or watercourse protections. Water quality issues, when and where present, were related to watercourse crossings that were not adequately designed or maintained, ground-based tractor yarding activities, and road drainage onto fire-impacted bare hill slopes in close proximity to watercourses. 40% of watercourse crossings were rated as substandard or unacceptable. So the evaluation report did not specifically identify the causal mechanisms for the poor ratings. So in other words, it's possible that the BMPs were installed correctly in most cases, but simply didn't perform well because they were not developed for use in the post-fire condition and post-fire conditions. So the report concluded with a number of recommendations, including increasing outreach and education to project submitters and operators, a need for the agencies to prioritize post-fire salvage inspections over inspections of other projects, and for the agencies to continue participating in CAL FIRE's monitoring efforts. So Central Valley Forest Activities Program staff will be taking what we learned from those evaluations and gathering additional data over the next 2 years in cooperation with program staff in the North Coast region to better understand the causal mechanisms behind the poor ratings. Our results will help determine if changes to the board's 2017 Timberland Management General Order of Waste Discharge requirements are needed, or even if recommendations for changes to the forest practice rules are needed. This photo in this slide was taken of one of the assessed salvage operations in the area burned by the 2018 Delta Fire in Shasta County. So the board's 2017 Timberland General Order provides regulatory coverage for activities on non-federal and U.S. Forest Service lands that have a commercial component. So this includes the vegetation management, forest practice rule timber harvest plans, timber harvest plan exemptions, and post-fire salvage activities. Pertinent to the wildfire discussion, the Timberland General Order includes additional criteria and conditions to protect water quality from post-fire salvage operations. This includes a certain percentage of ground cover required prior to herbicide applications and identification and mitigation of erosion sites. Central Valley Water Board staff have been and continue to be actively engaged on the fires in our region. We've conducted post-fire assessments and limited water quality monitoring for several 2018 fires that I mentioned earlier. We've processed Timberland General Order enrollments for more than 200 salvage projects for the 2018 fires alone. and conducted more than 125 inspections in response to the 2018 fires. We assisted CAL FIRE with inspections for post-fire salvage operations as part of that annual evaluation report that I mentioned, required by Senate Bill 901. We've engaged in outreach to state and local agencies managing fires in their jurisdictions. And we've worked with the Forest Practice Review Team, which has consisted of California Natural Resources Agency, CAL FIRE, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the California Geologic Survey on post-fire salvage operations in order to develop outreach tools. The image on the right in this slide is actually a new informational flyer that is now sent out with each post-fire salvage exemption that CAL FIRE accepts. And it details the risks to water quality from salvage operations and provides helpful information on permitting requirements. So in addition to the GIS tool that I talked about earlier that staff developed to prioritize utility corridor work, staff have also developed another tool to assist in identifying high priority sites when they're planning inspections on projects enrolled under the Timberland General Order. This image is an example of our incident tracker, and this is where notices of incident that are required under the Timberland General Order are mapped. Typically, notices of incident are for things like failures of roads and watercourse crossings, failures of best management practices, etc. So this specific example is an area that was salvage logged after the 2012 Bagley fire in Shasta County. And the board members may recall visiting that fire in 2016. It's an area that's subject to intense storms and produces high sediment loads, but is more than 3 hours travel time from the Redding office. So finding ways to help staff plan their inspections to make the best use of field time is really critical. The green dots that you can see here are where less than 25 cubic yards was mobilized, and the largest red ones are for discharges in excess of 500 cubic yards. So when staff select one of the dots that you saw in that last image, the system pulls up any documents or photos associated with that specific location so staff can better understand the history of the site for inspection planning purposes. All right, so I'm going to back out a little bit, higher level here. Program staff are involved in a number of interagency cooperative efforts to address the varied activities I've described thus far. Those include engaging with the CPUC on data collection and utility wildfire mitigation plan review, working with the Forest Practice Review Team to promote consistency and identify opportunities for outreach and education. Program staff have been coordinating meetings with PG&E and Southern California Edison, both to discuss normal vegetation management activities as well as post-fire activities in the wake of this year's fires. We're also focusing program staff time towards assisting all landowners, industrial, federal, and small landowners, to help them navigate the post-fire salvage permitting requirements. And we're prioritizing projects for field inspections. So the board's 2017 Timberland General Order of Waste Discharge Requirements provides regulatory coverage for a variety of activities, including a variety of forest practice rule exemptions like the small landowner and forest fire prevention exemptions modified by Senate Bill 901. For those exemptions, the Timberland General Order provides automatic but conditioned enrollment and allows for minimized monitoring. It also covers post-fire salvage and federal hazard tree removal projects. However, it does not address activities without a commercial component. This means activities under the Board of Forestry's CalVTP, as well as utility corridor and vegetation management activities without a commercial component, cannot be enrolled under the general order. So program staff are working in coordination with the Lahontan Regional Board staff right now on the development of a permit for each region that will address non-point source pollution from a variety of activities, including at this point vegetation management, on U.S. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management lands. So if you'll recall, one of my previous slides, I said that about 57% of the state's 33 million forested acres are managed by the federal agencies. Within the Central Valley region, that's about 69%, or just under 11 million of our forested acres are managed by the federal agencies. So the resulting proposed permit that staff plan to bring before the board will provide for expedited forest health and post-fire recovery project permitting. And the permit is currently anticipated to combine prescriptive, so like best management practices, and performance-based processes to achieve water quality improvements across the vast federal ownership in the two regions. It's also planned to be programmatic rather than project by project. In the past year, we've organized a permit development group that includes regional board staff and representatives from the two federal agencies. We've initiated tribal consultation and revised our project webpage. We've obtained the use of State Board's CEQA contract to have a consultant prepare the two EIRs, environmental impact reports, that are needed to support the permit. And we are currently engaged in providing feedback to the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service on draft best management practices to address non-point source pollution. Part of this effort also includes collaborating with the North Coast Regional Board as they currently permit a similar set of Forest Service activities, aiming for some level of consistency across regional board boundaries for the federal agency. Board members may recall that we had planned to have a joint workshop with the Lahontan region back in early September, but with COVID, that workshop has been delayed. All right, bear with me, I'm almost there. So given the broad scope and scale of the program, it's really probably no surprise that the permitting environment is both complex and complicated. The State Board is currently engaged in two permitting development projects that I chatted briefly with you about that'll impact our program. They're developing a statewide vegetation management permit and the statewide utility permit. The statewide vegetation management permit is currently envisioned to cover the CalVTP activities out beyond the 20 million acres of the SRA and potentially out onto federal lands. The statewide utility permit is envisioned to address a variety of utility activities, including those currently occurring under the Stormwater and 401 certification programs. This could also include utility activities in non-fire risk areas. Currently, the utilities are using kind of a mixed bag of permitting systems to conduct work with the potential to cause water quality impacts, including the statewide construction general permit, where they're using the programmatic stormwater pollution prevention plans to cover many of their projects, and the nationwide 12 for Federal Clean Water Act permitting of limited small CEQA exempt projects. Clean Water Act Section 401 certification are used for larger projects. They've got the option for the California Forest Practice Act utility right-of-way exemption that I spoke about, and the associated Timberland general order in the Central Valley for those exemptions. Each of these permits, in effect, kind of leaves a little bit of a gap in the way of treating maintenance activities. So a significant portion of the work the utilities are doing and will continue to do is in the foothills and mountains where fire risk is high, of course. And ground disturbance can be more threatening in those areas, specific to water quality, due to slope usually, sometimes soil depth and other erosion hazard factors work into that. However, the construction general permit provides an exemption related to the regrading of roads. So with that exemption, we can expect that pretty much all the road grading associated with wildfire mitigation projects could be occurring without regulatory coverage or oversight from the construction general permit. So given that's difficult for us because given that roads are our #1 contributor to excess sediment in our surface waters, and that a lot of these roads were not designed with continued access in mind, and that upgrades are likely to be necessary to meet water quality standards, the construction general permit exemption leaves us with not a real clear way to address that. The Central Valley Water Board's Timberland general order will likely be impacted by state board permitting actions, as well as potentially by Board of Forestry actions and our findings in evaluating post-fire salvage locking operations in the coming years. The current effort with the Lahontan Water Board to develop the non-point source permit for federal lands will also potentially be impacted by state board permitting actions, should they decide to cover vegetation management and utility management activities on federal lands. And with that, I'm so excited to hand this over to JJ Baum. And he's going to talk about plans for wildfire planning and response activities across the region.
Before you do that, Angela, if you could just go back briefly to that last slide where you made reference to the roads and the staff's inability to address some of those issues. If you will explain that one more time, if you don't mind. It was back in the previous slide, you were talking about the problems with the roads and how you were able to address it. So
yeah, there's so PG&E in particular is utilizing the construction general permits and a programmatic stormwater prevention pollution plan to handle a lot of the operations that they're conducting now in kind of the absence of a statewide utility permit. And the challenge that we have with the construction general permit is that there's an exemption that it's about the regrading, kind of the term that's used, regrading of roads. And regrading in our lexicon really just means disturbance of roads that maybe need erosion control measures or perhaps weren't designed well in the first place. And so given that is sort of, it's an exemption, it's something that they don't have to have specified in their permitting, then that makes it a little bit challenging for us. Certainly, we have been working with the utilities over the last handful of years, and a lot of the utilities are willing to kind of, I guess, but for lack of a better word, voluntarily provide additional protections and mitigations and erosion control. It's just that it's a little bit of a gap.
thank you very much.
You bet.
Angela, will that be addressed by any of the anticipated guidance documents that'll be coming out, or?
Yeah, Dr. Longley, my understanding is that State Board is spending quite a bit of time looking into the mechanisms that utilities are currently using so that they can identify where gaps exist as they evaluate the need and the scope of a statewide utility-specific permit.
Okay, and you probably don't have any idea when that might actually come into force, do you?
I think the last estimate I heard was that it's probably 2 years out. I mean, they still need to do CEQA for that permit. The Cal VTP based permit, they're going to be leveraging the CEQA that Cal Fire and the Board of Forestry did, so it can be on a faster track.
Okay, thank you.
Angela, this is Carmen. This is a really deep report and I appreciate it. What I was going to say to you is that when you mentioned that time that we were up there in 2016, I'll tell you that before I went up there, a lot of it was theoretical. Even though I saw wildfires on TV and I knew it's so different to be there in person. So I know that not all board members have got a chance to do that. And I know right now it's hard because of COVID, but I mean, there's nothing that's like hitting you on the head with a hammer as being out there and seeing the complexities of people trying to do the right thing, but not being able to, and people who have good intentions or people who are maybe, a little bit careless, but getting all that together was big. And so I think you did a great job in your presentation. I felt like I could go through it step by step because of the good tour that we had in 2016. So just want you to know that tour, even though it was complicated, still pays off dividends. So it was really worth doing.
Great, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. All right, JJ, I think it's all you.
Thank you, Angela. Did you want to just use the slides on your end?
I will.
All right, first, I thanks again, Angela, and thank you, Dr. Longley, and the other members of the board for the opportunity to provide a brief update on our wildfire response for 2020. Since joining the office in June, I've continued to learn about the diversity of our programs and efforts we support. Staff have been wonderfully welcoming, Angela included here, with bringing me on board and briefing me on things, and I'm honored to play a part in the regional board's mission. My concerns when coming on board were primarily focused on COVID-19. A lot has happened in the world since then, and part of those being these fires. And I was initially tasked to get involved with the wildfire issue as part of the LNU Lightning Complex fire, and then to help facilitate the plan for our office in 2020. So next slide, please. So 2020 is the year of unprecedented fires, as Angela mentioned. Since the beginning of the year, there have been 8,500 wildfires that have burned over 4.1 million acres in California. To date, the total number of fatalities statewide is 31, and more than 9,200 structures have been destroyed. There have been multiple fires within the footprint of Region 5, with each office having a significant fire at least partially within their typical area of responsibility. So per CAL FIRE incident site as of this morning, we had the August fire complex at over 1 million acres burned and 78% contained. North complex fire with 318,000 acres burned and 94% contained. The LNU lightning complex fire is over 360,000 acres burned, and it's fully contained. And then the Creek fire with over 344,000 acres burned and 60% contained as of CAL FIRE this morning. Sadly, we're still in the middle of the fire season, with it typically going through December. So next slide, please. Actually, go back there real quick, Angela. I wanted to point out kind of the distribution of these fires and how this is unprecedented in terms of effort level from our region to respond with the spread out of those efforts. So thank you. So lessons have been learned throughout the state in response to the past fires of past years, as Angela indicated. Government agencies have established standing teams to work on wildfire issues. One example being the emergency management program created at the state board. The staff at the emergency management program coordinate the response of the water board to other agencies, including Cal Office of Emergency Services. This important team has been inundated with work due to the amount of fires this season. The initial focus has been heavily placed on tracking the fire impacts to drinking and wastewater infrastructures. They will be shifting to a post-fire response and will be partnering with regional boards to address issues. The regional boards have been working with our impacted dischargers. Our agency is also known for our technical expertise on fires, thanks to the strong efforts in previous years by Angela at our Reading office and the Rancho Cordova office. We can share this technical expertise with state and regional partners and as funding permits. Additionally, given the amount of fires, we recognize the need to be surgical on identifying specific efforts to support that provide the most beneficial impact to water quality. So, all right, next slide. As Angela mentioned, our office has learned a considerable amount from earlier fires. With that experience has come knowledge on how to address technical issues encountered. We also recognize the need to share that knowledge and grow capabilities within each office for this year and subsequent fire seasons. Due to the amount and distribution of fires, we are identifying and training technical teams in each office. These teams will be able to work with our regional and state partners as opportunities and funding allows. Staff training has been initiated that includes both the field and online training events. Training focuses on identifying fire intensity and selection of BMPs to address issues. On-site trainings are limited in size to 5 to 7 people due to COVID concerns. The lead instructor for these events is Mr. Richard Mull, who will be speaking more on these efforts at the enforcement presentation later today. Additionally, he's been developing tools that have been utilized for our staff and can be available to the other regional boards and state board as well. The classes that we've initiated have garnered interest from others, including the state and other regional boards. Emergency management program staff attended the inaugural field training event, and on-site trainings have occurred both for our Rancho Cordova and Fresno offices and staff. In the anticipation that our trained team members can assist on these identified events in partnership with the state board and within our regular business lines of work, which have been impacted to an unprecedented level in 2020. And with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Thoughts? Okay.
I will say one interesting development while we were giving this presentation, Governor Newsom tweeted that he just had a conversation with the president, and apparently the federal government is reversing its decision to withhold federal funding for the fires. So maybe they were watching this presentation. Who knows?
I can't believe it. How, like, there's never been a shift in position that fast.
Okay. Proceeding on. Are there any? First of all, let me say, both presentations very good. Thank you very much. Are there any questions or discussion by board members?
Yeah, I mean, Angela, it's just so crazy to all the work that you guys are doing. You think you'd have 1,000 staff members on your team, but I would say that's the well coordination you have done with all the collaboratives that you pulled together and the amount of resources. It's a tremendous amount of work, hardships from 2018 to now, and you guys are still doing an awesome job. So the presentations were great. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Any further comments? I have a question, Angela. When we talk about our participation, the regional board's participation in forest management, I would presume that that is pretty narrowly defined, and such things as prescribed burns and so forth would not be part of that. That would be more with CAL FIRE and possibly other folks. Is that correct or not?
Well, I think that forestry topics, what we're really talking about is primarily sediment discharges.
Right.
Sediment discharges occur when our slopes are bare. And so I think that there's certainly room for the water boards to be aware of and engaged in the discussion about prescribed fire. But I think, the intent of prescribed fire is not to create bare conditions. So I think it's safe to say that that's an activity that really shouldn't represent a high risk to water quality.
Right. So because we are concerned so much about sediment and its role in stream degradation, that pretty much limits us to post-fire activities as opposed to preventive measures. Am I correct or not? I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
You mean you're talking about our involvement?
Our involvement, yes.
No, I would say that post-fire is certainly, where we're in a reactive mode. We're looking for ways to mitigate kind of the human additions to the post-fire situation that complicate the sediment transport issues. But I think, really we would much rather be on the proactive side and encouraging people to take appropriate vegetation management activities on that are done in a manner that isn't going to impact the water courses, and it can be done. We've got a lot of best management practices. We know quite a lot about what's successful out in the woods. When we move down into the foothills and we start getting into, in the southern part of the state where there's chaparral, that's a different situation. It's not one I'm familiar with, really. So that certainly could represent some additional challenges. But I think ultimately we're really looking to be in a more proactive place. I think the whole state's looking for that.
I think there are conditions that somewhat approximate Southern California in the Southern Sierra. Some of the areas I think of are heavy brush, and you get a fire in there, it's very, very difficult to control. Well, you've pretty well answered my questions. What you were talking about earlier, though, fascinated me, and that was that in earlier times, before the European invasion, if you will, of California took place, the Native Americans were somewhat involved in considerable burning. And if you don't have to do it here, but I'd be interested in your source on that material. Also, you're probably aware of this, but the U.S. Forest Service had a laboratory for a period of time in the Fresno area, and they were working on I'm trying to think now, North Fork of the Kings. And I think they had a township up there that they treated it a number of different ways, looking at different kinds of burns and other treatments. And that report is a very interesting report. And then I sent you a email with an attachment. John Mount is a local hero in some respects. He is a forester, worked for Southern California Edison, and I sent you just one paper. He has a lot of papers on forest management, and since he had worked for Southern California Edison, he's certainly used to the perspective of those folks. So I think that paper also is of some interest. Anyway, thank you for a great presentation. And Clint, is there something we missed?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate Angela and JJ putting that together. There's a lot of work going on in this area. There's no question. I did notice Cedric Twite from SPI. I don't know if you have any cards before you leave the item, but I just thought I'd throw that reminder in there.
Say again, please.
Cedric Twite from SPI joined the call. I just wanted a reminder in case he had submitted a card.
We'll get to him in a moment. Very good. Also, another just alarming thing. I mentioned the paper talking about we've seen bad fire years in the past. This is the worst, and pointing out that this may not be the worst. The future may be worse. And then the numbers that Angela gave in times in the past, we're in for some real interesting times. Very good. We'll go on to interested persons. And Clint mentioned one individual. I don't see him up here in the comments or in the blue cards.
He may not have submitted one.
Okay, could you bring him up, please?
Sure.
Mr. Twite, yes. I see that now.
You can unmute yourself, Mr. Twite.
Hello.
Good afternoon, Mr. Twite. Normally in the October meeting, we're up in the Reading area and you could stare us directly in the eye, but these are different times. So welcome, and we're certainly interested in what you have to say.
Good, and you can hear me?
Hear you very well.
Fantastic. Hey, hello, board. Yeah, it's been a while, so I guess this is as good as it gets in terms of FaceTime. And this is the topic du jour for myself, since we're approaching 1,800,000 acres of ownership in the state, and I certainly want to engage in any kind of activities related to the timber program. Appreciate Angela's presentation. There's a lot of operators out there, so I always have to remind myself that she's not speaking directly at Sierra Pacific when she's providing this feedback, which, from the outside listening, it sounds like the glass is kind of half empty. A few things that, in my opinion, are things to consider the glass being half full, and that is, for example, the report that she indicated went to the legislature that was instigated by SB 901. The report findings are revealing in the sense that they did, while there are some bad statistics, and it was a sample of all the operators, it didn't call out any particular folks. It said that the acceptable scores correlated well with the implementation of the forest practice rules, and specifically where the road rules were fully implemented. And so I think that that's a good sign. That means that the rules, where they're implemented properly, you know, and an emergency notice requires a registered professional forester to administer, and the public trust agencies are supposed to also have oversight on those. The outcomes were pretty good. So were folks dropping the ball? Were RPFs dropping the ball, not overseeing their licensed timber operators adequately? Yeah, there probably were plenty of those instances. But that just means that the professionals, in my opinion, and I reminded our staffs at our annual meeting that, you know, we have an important responsibility to implement the forest practice rules and implement the general order when we're implementing our emergency notices. And, you know, we need to tighten our belts and make sure we're doing a good job. I think we've done that pretty well. It also recommended that review team agencies prioritize inspections to address concerns and track the inspections in order to facilitate feedback and adaptive management. So folks, when they have the equipment on the ground right then, oh wow, I got a timer, we can, that productive, you know, restorative work can be done. The other thing that report didn't do, it didn't report on the potential restoration work that occurred during the emergency notice process, which is, you know, quite frankly, a quite large oversight, because there can be some significant negative impacts for not getting your men and women and equipment out there to do restorative work where there's threats to water quality. And, you know, our own investigation of fire salvage operations shows that you can reduce sediment impact in the first 2 years by almost twice as much by taking actions and doing salvage operations. In addition, there's no retrospective look at the efforts of reforestation of these burnt wildlands and some of the kind of the contrasting conditions of folks that have taken, you know, proactive approaches to wildfire and the restoration and not. And then finally, you know, just to toot our own horn a little bit, at the campfire, one of the inspection reports that we were able to receive, and I'm sorry to say I don't see enough inspection reports coming out of the Central Valley Water Board staff about their investigations, because I think it'd be helpful both from a, you know, public disclosure perspective and also to provide some of that feedback back to the professionals about how well they're doing. And it will create a dialogue, I think, that's in time with issues that are being that arise. But this one happens to be on a couple, and it was done by Justin Lanier. So thank him for doing that. And I'll wrap up real quickly.
Okay.
It says to date, the discharger, Sierra Pacific Industries, this happens to be on our Sterling district because it was part of the campfire, has done significant amounts of road maintenance and improvements on both private and county maintained logging roads. This work included road and crossing improvements on roads that will not be used for hauling in the near term and represents work done beyond the best management practices required, specific under the timber general order. Roads are experiencing heavy use during the dry season of 2019 as salvage logging operations continue to harvest fire damaged trees within the November 2018 campfire to avoid loss of timber.
Thank you very much, sir.
That's all I had, and thanks for indulging me for that extra bit of time. But you know, we're doing our best to help combat these issues.
When you introduced yourself, you may have stated it. If so, I apologize if I missed it. But you're with Sierra Pacific Industries, and we've spoken before, I believe, on our tours in your area. So.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your input. I think you identified a number of items that we need to look at, and we will proceed accordingly. Thank you, sir. Any questions for Mr. Twite? Thank you very much. Do we have anybody else wishing to speak to the board?
Not at this time.
Okay. Then we will limit ourselves to discussion by board members and staff. Is there any other information that board members would like to have at this time, or?
No, I will say, Carl, I did send you one of the academic papers that suggested that, yes, it was actually close to 4.5 million acres burned annually prior to European settlement in California, which is incredible. I think it will be interesting to try and get our vegetation management up to that level. My personal sense is that two of the biggest limiting factors is one, liability coverage, because it is very difficult to keep prescribed burns within the exact parameters of where you want it. Fire is an unpredictable thing, and you will have fire, if you do have an extensive prescribed burn, some of them will meander past the areas that you're anticipating burning. So making sure that there's adequate safety and liability provisions in for that is critical to making that a part of the landscape. And the other thing I think that is incredibly important to realize too is, the paper that I forwarded to you basically says that California had smoky skies for the summer. That's just how it was. That was a part of California, or certainly Central Valley life prior to European colonization. And so I think that, there has to be some degree of acceptance by the general public that if we're going to effectively manage our forests and have fire be a very significant part of that management, you're going to trade off a few sunny days for some smoky days. And the ramifications of that and the need for public support and acceptance of that is a huge hurdle. I mean, I think Californians rightly view it as a tremendous victory about how Los Angeles' air quality was transformed, and the metric has become clear skies are the best answer in all circumstances. But I think the dawning realization is that, clear skies every day in the summertime may be incompatible with a prescribed fire regime that actually deals with the full scope of the issues that we have. I mean, even a relatively small, prescribed burn, hopefully you're doing it in the right conditions, hopefully you're doing it in the cooler weather, that you're able to limit that. But it's a complex undertaking. And, I would love it to have the state have all those pieces in place to effectively use fire as a tool that it needs to. We're at a huge deficit right now. We're in terms of a fire deficit, we're going to have these incredibly intense fires until we kind of catch up with veg management one way or the other. At least is my personal opinion there. And again,
no, I think you're right. The 4 million plus acres that we're burning each year on the average speaks to the amount of fuel that was generated on an annual basis, really. And if we don't have those fires, we're getting, at least on a comparable order, probably that generation of fuel each year, and it's just adding to itself. And when you do get a fire, then it is such a hot fire that becomes extremely difficult to control. So this is going to be a challenge like none other. And by the way, I'm glad that there's been a reversal and California is being recognized. Washington has in need of some help, but the kind of help that we need really goes far beyond that. We need to be able to put together forest management practices that are in line with reality. So thank you very much. Any board members have any comments before we go to the next item?
Yeah, my last comment is my concern, which is why I raised a question earlier about the utilities and, what the their involvement, I won't say their involvement, but those utility lines that contribute to some of the fires, as well as the erosion of the sediment as a result of the roads, um, being worked on there, and just where are we in, and as are we feeling comfortable with where we are in addressing some of those issues and working with the utility companies? To me, that was a big concern. There were a lot of other concerns there, but that one kind of stood out.
You may respond to that, Patrick. Yeah, Ms. Kadar, first off, our regulation of utility corridor work is brand new at the boards. Really sort of introduced with Senate Bill 901 and the staff that are supporting that effort. We've got a lot of work to do, as Angela talked briefly about, with regard to developing a working relationship, California Public Utilities Commission, State Board, the other allied agencies that are involved in utility corridor work. I think too, to be frank, I think the boards really have to take a hard look at our role in wildfire. We've talked a little bit about, sediment delivery. We've talked a little bit about control burns. When you think about the history of fire suppression in the Western U.S. and California in particular, many of the laws that we currently enact, that we currently require dischargers to comply with, were developed, post suppression activities. And I think where we're at now is we have to take a hard look and really be honest with ourselves. I think, are some of the things that we are doing as regulatory agencies contributing to some of that catastrophic wildfire? I don't think that's the case in many instances, but I think at least there's an opportunity there for a frank discussion to assure that, at least within the Central Valley Water Board, that there's an adequate balance of regulation and suppression, recognizing that catastrophic wildfire can undo, years, decades worth of hard work by the water boards in protecting water quality. So I just leave you with that. These are decisions that we're going to have to wrestle with over the next few years.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I'll just, my last comment is, you guys are doing a tremendous job. Like I said, that just stood out, and I know it's new, but you've handled so many other efforts, and you've done a tremendous job at it. This is another task and challenge, but I know you guys will do your best. So thank you.
Very good.
And I will note real quick, Mr. Twite does have his hand up. I think we need to be cognizant of the time limitations that we're operating under. And should anybody want to submit additional comments on these matters, send a letter to me, and I will forward it to the board members so that you can kind of receive it.
And I would appreciate that. And by the way, if you do submit written comments, it becomes permanent. So, very good. If board members have no further comments, we're ready to move on to agenda item 20. Hearing no comments. Agenda item 20 is the enforcement program update. At this time, the board will hear an update on the Central Valley Water Board's enforcement program. This is an information item only and no action will be taken, although the board members may ask questions and provide direction to staff. After the staff presentation, interested persons will be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board, and we'll now begin with the staff presentation.
Okay, Carrie, I can host this for you, or you can run it. Your choice.
Unmute. Thank you, Jean. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. So my internet connection is a bit unstable, so if you wouldn't mind running the slides, that would be much appreciated. I may drop off or freeze in some freestyle way,
problem.
But I will be on audio because I'm on the phone. So.
I'll bring that up. And here we go.
Thank you. So good afternoon, Chair Longley, members of the board. I'm Carrie Holmes. I'm a supervising engineer in the Rancho Cordova office. I'm also the program manager of the Compliance and Enforcement Program for Region 5. Today I'll be providing an informational item updating the board about the Compliance and Enforcement Program's accomplishments and 2021 goals and priorities. Next slide. So I'll walk through the 1920 work plan and accomplishments. I didn't have a chance to do that last year, so I will do that to show you how we fared. And then I'll move on to the 2021 work plan and where we are with the first quarter during these difficult times, obviously. And then I'll talk a little bit about the Central Valley Water Board's enforcement priorities, state board initiatives that Region 5 is actively participating in. And then lastly, I'll talk about 2020, unpredictable issues as we all know. So next slide. I'd like to begin by commending the compliance and enforcement staff really for their flexibility. I mean, this year has been unlike any other, and their commitment to protecting public health and the environment during what's turned out to be a difficult year has surprised me and exceeded expectations. And, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that many of our compliance and enforcement staff and managers are not only hard at work in their homes as engineers, scientists, geologists, aides, but they're also multitasking, as you all know. They're parenting, they're full-time teachers now, chefs, housekeepers. I think the pets can be a little more problematic than the kids sometimes, but that's just my opinion. But I would really just like to commend our staff because their ability to adapt and keep work moving forward and be productive has been really, really amazing, and I commend them. Next slide. So as you know, I came to you in February of last year, and I didn't have a full enforcement update for you at that point because I had just started in the position, but I wanted to kind of reflect back on 1920 and show you that our inspection achievements were primarily met. We've exceeded most of the objectives in our inspections, with the exception of NPDES wastewater. And quite honestly, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a little bit of pause, both by staff and management, to send folks to inspect wastewater facilities because we knew COVID would absolutely be running through these facilities. And so we erred on the side of caution, but I think we still did relatively very well.
Carrie, this is Dr. Long. You have no need to apologize. You guys did a tremendous job, and as I look at the other regions, I'm extremely proud of what staff in this region has done.
Yeah, not only that, Dr. Longley, I'm just looking at the list that she has here, and they exceeded over 100% in all categories except for two, and that was 89 and 90%. So, I mean, that's incredible work.
Yeah, and I'll join with those comments also.
Staff have been amazing. I mean, our compliance and enforcement team, I'm lucky enough that we've got a very veteran established team, and they know their job and they're passionate about their work, and they do what it takes. So I appreciate that. I'm sure they will as well. Next slide.
I said, okay.
So just as a comparison for 1920 inspections over the regions, I think we fell generally where we're supposed to. We're a large region. We had 1793 inspections, close to 2,000. Region 8 obviously was the winner chicken dinner, but you know, they have quite a few stormwater sites that they inspect in a much smaller region. So I just like to point that out, not to take away from the work that they do. But one of the problems we do have in Region 5 is the extension of our you know, very large region, and travel and all that can be difficult. Next slide. So 1920 enforcement actions, again, as you know, I generally only look at inspections for targets because enforcement actions are unpredictable. But overall, we did extremely well last year, even though the pandemic was and the stay-at-home orders were implemented during part of this fiscal year. We ended up with 1,145 actions, which is very good. We've got 443 NOVs. Stormwater, we had notices of non-compliance at 618. We've been really ramping that effort up. I'll talk about that a little bit later. 13267s, we issued 45. TSOs, we had 2. CAOs, we had 1. And ACLs, we had 36. Next slide. So regional board enforcement actions for the year, we fared pretty well. I mean, I think, it really reflects on our staff. They're doing all the work. The pandemic actually assisted in some instances because they were able to work on more of their enforcement actions and, you know, kind of desktop exercises as opposed to being out in the field because of limitations. So I think we're doing really well there, and I do anticipate a little bit of a difference this year, but I'll explain that later. Next slide. Over the last 5 years, I just want to give you guys an indication quickly that we're maintaining, right? So we're probably 1,200 to 1,625 approximately as far as a range, and I think that that's very consistent, and I'm really happy with the progress. Next slide. So the first quarter 2021 inspections, they were light, not extremely light, nothing that I'm honestly that worried about. I did look back over the first quarters for the last 10 years or so, and we do tend to be on the lighter side in the first quarter. And I think that has to do with things such as batch MMPs for MPDS facilities and efforts that are large in nature like that. We tend to do those in the second and fourth quarter. So I'm really happy with the progress we've made. I will point out that we have been conducting quite a few virtual inspections. We haven't been recording them as inspections under EPA's guidance unless we physically visit the site. So this might be a little bit of an underestimation moving forward because a lot of our staff have been doing virtual inspections, meaning they're asking for information they would ask for to review during a physical inspection. They're doing a lot of that from home. And then the last step has been trying to coordinate that formal on-site inspection. So I think we're going to see our numbers increase quite a bit here. But as you can see, I added the 1920 fiscal year at the far end of the column here. And I don't feel like we're doing all that, bad. I think we're making really good progress, and I expect next quarter for those inspections to really increase as we work with State Board on virtual inspections. So, next slide. So inspections during the pandemic obviously have been more challenging for staff. You know, my number one goal has been to make sure that our staff are safe and their families. So we've obviously implemented a lot of safety protocols, working with State Board as well. We've had more training, more PPE. We've ordered quite a few mask sanitation wipes for vehicles, steering wheels, that sort of thing. And then lastly, the training. Office of Enforcement has been working on a virtual inspection type of a training / just guidance, I think, for the regions, because we want to make sure that we're getting the bean counted, but we also want to make sure that the inspections are doing what they need to do and evaluating each site in person if that's what's needed. So I will have more information on those in the future. Next slide. (2021) cleanup and UST goals for the first quarter were on the low side. And I will say that this is largely in part due to the fact that they were understaffed. They had many, many vacancies, and my understanding is that they're going to be hiring 3 engineering geologists in the very near future. So I anticipate these numbers ramping up and us kind of getting back on track, basically. And then just as a side note, when I was working on the work plan for enforcement, we did try to reduce our projection for this year because we were aware of some of the challenges that were ahead. Next slide. So thus far, we have had a total of 174 enforcement actions for quarter 1. Like I mentioned earlier, these can't be predicted all that easily, but I will mention that productivity in the actions has been reduced to some extent, obviously due to the pandemic and all of the other issues that we're dealing with. However, you know, this year we're looking at about 200. I just checked the website or the database today, and we're over 200 now. Last year, 1920's first quarter, I think we were about at 500, and so you can definitely see a difference there. I do anticipate next quarter ramping these up because these actions are a lot of actions that can be accomplished from home, quite frankly. And so we have been looking at more, doing more of these enforcement actions and focusing on getting those either into settlement phase, negotiation, or presented to the board. Next slide. So I'm going to talk really quickly about enforcement priorities for 2021, and these have morphed. Quite frankly, I think the enforcement priorities and every other program's priorities at Region 5 are ever evolving and very dynamic, especially this year. But really what we've been focusing on is internal communication, mostly between permitting and enforcement staff in the non-15 and Title 27 permitting arenas, as we have split functions that we're working through some issues and trying to make that more efficient. In addition, we've got CV salts on our radar, and we have stepped up in my opinion, in a large way when it comes to water quality and homelessness. Next slide. So as far as communication is concerned, we've been trying internally, this is 3 offices that I'm the enforcement coordinator over all 3 offices, but quite frankly, I had to start from within and in the Rancho office. And that's where I've been focusing a lot of my time, and my staff have been putting a lot of effort into. So we've had quite a few meetings between permitting and enforcement within the Rancho office. We have recently developed and finalized a communication and split function review matrix that I understand EMG is going to be taking a look at. So I'm excited about that, and I expect that we're going to be evolving and learning from what has been working and what has not, as you heard yesterday with the strategic planning effort.
So you mentioned you mentioned the Rancho office, but this is going to be applicable. The outcome is going to be applicable to all offices. Is that correct?
I think that's to be determined, because every office has such a different way of operating right now. It depends on the program, their PYs, their resources, and I can't honestly answer that question that we're going to all operate extremely streamlined. But I do expect some very positive changes are afoot. So.
Patrick, please.
Yeah, and so this goes to the fact that within different programs, and this is, I mean, realistically, when you take a look at some of the numbers, and it looks like they're slow. Carrie is really revamping with JJ a lot of what the internal function of the enforcement unit does and what they look like, and really their kind of core mission. And so we have different programs, so that especially the WDR, Stormwater, cannabis to a lesser extent these days, but it used to be set up this way, Title 27, where in some offices they have a cadre of people that write the permits. Then once the permit's written, the monitoring reports and compliance is done by enforcement. Now, we don't have big enough offices in Redding and Fresno to do that to the extent that we do in Rancho Cordova. So that's why the internal communication, when you do have the staff to split that, the internal communication becomes more complicated. And I think right now we're weighing the costs and benefits of that additional layers for various programs. I think with programs like Stormwater, it's relatively easy because the permit is essentially written at the state board level. With stuff like WDR's, Title 27, to a lesser extent, some of the other programs, it gets a little more complicated. And I think the big thing that is looming on the horizon is that the CV salts, the folks who don't comply with CV salts requirements and really put drinking water at issue, or are putting drinking water at issue currently, but once we have a program in place to say you have to fix this, that's a huge new task that shows up on the plate of compliance and enforcement. So a lot of these kind of moves on the chessboard that Carrie and JJ, and to a lesser extent myself and the other AEOs are looking at, is really trying to make sure that we have the ability to respond to what the board says are its priority issues. And at this juncture, I think as far as groundwater is concerned, drinking water and implementation of CV salts is the priority issue. And because that's a huge workload coming in next fiscal year, I think we want to make sure that we're able to absorb that with our compliance and enforcement resources.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Carrie.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with all of that. That's exciting. I think we're evolving, so it'll be good. So the WDR issue paper meetings that permitting and enforcement staff have been having have been extremely useful. I mean, the real thing that we're getting out of these meetings is that we've got permitting and compliance enforcement staff preparing separate issue papers when it's time to develop a new WDR or a renewal. And so we're really kind of bringing to the surface what the issues are between the permitting and enforcement folks, because we do have that split function. And so what I'm trying to do is kind of negotiate some middle ground and a path forward. And I think we've been pretty successful moving forward, but it's going to take a little bit of time. This has been in place for a while, so we're changing ideas here and getting folks on board.
And just,
then compliance, yeah.
And I think for some of the background there, so the idea here is it used to be that compliance and enforcement wasn't really involved in issuing permits at all. You issue the permit and then kind of compliance and enforcement just took the permit as it is. And, you know, there's a whole mix in that some permits were more stringent than the discharger can comply with. And I think that gives compliance and enforcement a tough task when they don't have reasonable things to point to in the permit. And on the flip side, some permits had and still do have language that is not as enforceable as it should be. So it's you know, I think the idea was we get compliance and enforcement to, you know, put our permit language under a microscope and make sure that they can tear off an enforcement case off of any violation in these waste discharge requirements or Title 27 permit or other type of enforcement action, 13267, et cetera. So when those conversations started, it quickly comes to light that there are different ways of solving these problems. And so what we've been working on is figuring out how to streamline that process, how to engage, how to systematically kind of work through that process of making sure that by the time a permit comes to the board, we have buy-in from both the permit writers that, yes, this deals with the most pertinent water quality impacts and results in compliance in the basin plan, and compliance and enforcement able to say, and if they don't do X, Y, and Z, we have clear ramifications, and we can easily build an enforcement case off of that. Because I think the worst situation, you know, is you have an ambiguous permit, and then when it comes time for enforcing it, you have enforcement staff and permitting staff both saying, yeah, that's a problem at the facility, but the permit itself doesn't give you a strong kind of sense of, all right, now here's what we do about it. Here's the penalty that we could impose and the leverage that we have over a discharger. So again, it's a unbelievable amount of effort. I think it gets even more complicated in this Zoom COVID world, but you know, I think Carrie's up to it, and I think JJ's up to it, and I think the folks on the permitting side are as well.
Thank you.
So where we were, complaints enforcement, they provide comments to permitting on draft WDRs, and this has occurred for a number of years, but we're working on a more formalized process so that the comments can be addressed from more of a programmatic level. If we have issues that come up, recurring issues that come up, we can then elevate those to EMG and get some very clear direction. As well as identifying site-specific issues and having very technical conversations. I think that's been extremely helpful for all of our staff, enforcement, permitting alike, right? So they're hearing and learning about issues that maybe they've never really thought about before. So it's also a training tool. And then we have been having more frequent emails, so we have more documentation, improved documentation. What I mean there is, you know, our dischargers are our friends, but they oftentimes can use our split function a bit against us. So what we're trying to do is establish a path forward, and improved documentation is going to help us get there. Next slide. So strategic planning efforts. So that presentation yesterday was great. I hadn't seen it or really heard much of it, and I'm very invigorated because, you know, it means our programs are going to evolve, and I can't wait to see what information and feedback they have, and working with them to evolve our program. I think it's going to be really good. So internally, we want to improve consistency and enforceability of WDRs we already discussed, improve efficiencies between permitting and compliance and enforcement. And then next steps, I'm really going to be looking to our new AEO, JJ Baum, and our executive management team to help us make some more programmatic decisions that help with interpretation of regulations and what our real goal is here, what the intent is, and how do we get there. The other thing that's extremely necessary, I think, especially for new employees, are not only documenting decisions, but providing guidance and standard operating procedures and permit writing tools for staff that are going to be coming on board and for staff that exist. Next slide. CV faults, I don't have a huge update here. I'm sure you guys hear about this more than I do, but I will say that for compliance and enforcement, we've got Guy Childs from the Rancho Cordova office that participates on the RED team, which is an implementation team. It's technical in nature, and it's going to really provide us an opportunity to put in the compliance and enforcement aspect when decisions are made moving forward. The nitrate program notice to comply has been sent. Deliverables are due in March 2021. For the salt program, the notice to comply are going to be issued in or around November 2020. We've got a ton of facilities, 1,000 plus waste discharge requirement facilities that are going to receive this notice. It's going to be a tremendous effort. Patrick mentioned that earlier. So we're going to be looking forward. We're going to be working together with the CV Salts team and probably most programs to establish a strategy for CV Salts enforcement. Next slide. So now I'm going to let actually Rich Moll come in and talk a little bit about water quality and homelessness, as he has been the leader for Region 5 in this effort, and I cannot appreciate his work and his diligence more. So I'm going to let him talk a little bit about what he's done and the efforts he's working on.
Okay, can everyone hear me? I hope.
I hear you well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Carrie. My name is Rich Mall, and I'm a senior environmental scientist with the Compliance Enforcement Unit in Rancho Cordova office. Today, I'm going to talk about 3 projects to address homelessness. Steelhead Creek, I'm going to briefly talk about the Stockton Area Task Force, and then I'm going to talk about the Smith Canal cleanup, which was very extensive. Next slide. So the Steelhead Creek cleanup we've done for 3 years. And this year, due to COVID-19, we utilized heavy equipment with the help from Dr. Brady and Crystal Tobias to remove trash and debris from Steelhead Creek. We were able to utilize work crews. We were not able to utilize work crews that previously provided people power to pile up the trash and consolidate it so we could move it with the heavy equipment. So to try and maximize our efforts, we started by passing out trash bags. This was semi-successful, but the trash bags were supplied by the Department of Water Resources, who's been a partner with us throughout the cleanups. We then utilized track bobcats, backhoes, and dump trucks to remove the trash and debris. Reclamation District 1000 picked up trash the first day. RD 1000 picked up trash the second day. And the third remaining day, City Parks came up and picked up the remaining trash bags. Park rangers provided security throughout and support throughout the project. And during the effort, we were able to remove 15,300 pounds of trash and debris from the watershed. Most importantly, we were able to remove some of the abandoned camps. Abandoned camps are always an issue when we do homeless cleanups, because they tend to have a lot more material. And additionally, we picked up a lot of couches, a lot of chairs, a lot of large items that would have probably floated down Steelhead Creek. These are our partners. This slide kind of represents the partners. It's the same partners every year that work with us. And every year when it's over, I bring up, do you want to do it next year? And they say, yeah, let's do it again. So it's a nice partnership. And hopefully we can do it again next year. Next slide. Here's a couple pictures. The one on the left is just a picture of one of the camps before we actually did the cleanup. And what you'll find, we got the homeless campers to put some of the trash in the bags. And then we kind of encourage them just to push some of the rest of the trash to the side. And then we used either track bobcats or the equipment you see on the right-hand side, the backhoe, to pick up the material and transfer it to vehicles, trucks, so we could haul it off-site. Next slide. So before I talk about the Smith Canal cleanup, I want to talk just briefly about the Stockton Area Homeless Task Force. The Stockton Area Homeless Task Force was formed to help address some of the homeless issues in Stockton. And it's really done with facilitation and support from the State Board's Office of Public Participation. And it's a collaborative partnership between state agencies and local agencies in the Stockton area. The task force is addressing multiple issues related to homelessness, including COVID-19, naturally, sanitation, clean drinking water, safe camping, housing locations, coordination of cleanups, and identifying funding sources. Coordinating cleanups have really been one of the successful outcomes of this partnership. We've really been meeting about every 4 to 6 weeks or so since June. And the Smith Canal cleanup, which I'm going to talk about in a second, is a direct result of these discussions. So I want to give you just a little bit of background on the Smith Canal project, and then I'll walk through these photos. And there's another series of photos right after this. So the area of concern on Smith Canal is located directly into the I-5 bridge just south of Country Club Boulevard in Stockton. The property on both sides of the canal is heavily impacted by over 160 campers. And the thing about this, they're jammed into a really small area. A grocery store, Big Lots, grade school, and middle school are located on the north side of the canal, and a large subdivision is on the south side of the canal. Residents there's a footbridge that goes from one side to another, and residents use the footbridge to go back and forth to the facilities on the north side and the south side. There have been a number of impacts. There have been a number of safety issues related to the homeless camping in this area. And so one of the biggest things is that the homeless folks are cutting the fencing and dumping 5-gallon buckets of human waste into the canal. In addition, again, as I said, it's a big safety issue. So in order to kind of mitigate some of this stuff, in early September, the city of Stockton went in and did a full cleanup. And some of the areas that I'm showing in the pictures right now were not able to be cleaned up because they're on the Caltrans right away. But this week, Caltrans went in and cleaned those areas up. So in the upper left, you'll see an area there where that's just where they're actually digging into the footing under the bridge. So they're camping very close to the water. The water comes up almost to the top of the bridge at times. And so it's a significant water quality issue. On the bottom left, you can see a photo where they're basically digging into the levees. And this is pretty extensive in this area. It's really down through the whole area. And then on the right-hand side is just another photograph of where they're camped under the bridge. Keep in mind, there's 2 bridges. This is one. There's one bridge on the other side too. Both sides are exactly like this. And the picture on the bottom right is just where they're cutting the fence. They cut the fence almost every single day and dump the 5-gallon buckets of waste into the canal. So it's a significant water quality issue. Next slide. Here's a couple more photos. The one on the upper left is just the walkway where folks have to walk through, and the campers are right there up against it, and there's been some harassment and other things. The bottom left is the footbridge that everybody complains about because it's not safe to cross, same one that they keep cutting the fence on. The upper right is just when we were doing one of our inspections. We typically have support from Stockton PD because it's not that safe to go down there. And then the bottom right, there is just a cleanup effort by the city of Stockton. Now, one of the things that happened in the last week or so I wanted to mention is that they've put cut-proof fencing on the bridge. Allegedly, you can't, or supposedly you're not supposed to be able to cut through the fencing, so they're not going to be able to do this. And then on the north side, on the bottom, if you look at the bottom picture there of that bridge, they also put fencing so they don't have access on the north side, which should restrict, hopefully, some of the campers from going to that location. Just really an unsafe location. There's so many people clustered in. It's a COVID issue. It's a public health issue. It's just about every issue you can imagine.
But Rich, unless you find some way to provide them access to sanitation devices, that problem's not going to be solved. One way or another, they're going to be spreading fecal material and other contaminated products that will cause a problem, if nothing else, by stormwater runoff.
Absolutely, and thanks for bringing that up. They actually put in sanitation units in this area, and they lasted about 3 or 4 weeks before they just disappeared. No one quite knows where they went, but one of them I know got taken apart. The other one just kind of disappeared. So, and then one of them got filled with trash. And so it's been a real challenge. We talked about that at the task force meeting this last week, about sanitation and clean drinking water, both. And how do you provide that in a way, because some homeless folks, that's exactly what they need. That's exactly what they want. And other folks just aren't on board, and then those facilities get destroyed. So we talked about, how do you do that? Do you have like facilities that are monitored 24/7, or how do you go about doing it? So there was a big discussion at the task force meeting on.
How does this compare with experiences along the Lower American River? The
issue in this area is it's so concentrated. There are so many folks clustered in this small area. It's I wouldn't say worse. I would just say that it's just got such a dense population that it's created a whole other set of issues. That's kind of what I would say. But it's bad. And I mean, and the sad part, the difficult part, let me word it that way, is that some of the homeless folks are trickling back in. And so we could potentially have end up with the same situation again. But we did get the trash pulled out, and it is much cleaner. And hopefully the living conditions are much cleaner for the folks that live there. And there's a lot of effort on outreach right now to folks that were in the area when they were removed, to try and give them a step up, to let them know where they can go, to let them know about resources. And so hopefully that makes a difference too.
Is there documentation describing the destruction, dismantling, and so forth of the sanitation devices?
That was discussed by the city. I can find out. The city was very frustrated over they described how many units they put in throughout Stockton. I don't recall the number. It was a fairly high number of units, and most of those disappeared.
Don't want you to have to spend a lot of time on it, but if it's pretty readily available, I'd like to have a copy of that.
Okay, absolutely.
Don't spend a lot of time on it, please.
Okay, thank you. All right, next slide, I think.
Suppose it's back to me then. Thank you, Rich. And he's going to come back in a little bit and talk a little about the fire effort, even though you've heard extensively. I want Rich to be able to explain the efforts on his behalf, because it's extensive and amazing. And so, state board enforcement priorities for 2021. I've really tried to work with state board and collaborate on some of these priorities, because quite frankly, they're offering up resources and paying attention. And so where we can assist, I would like to be involved. So two of those areas are the PFAS 13267 orders, as well as environmental justice issues and stormwater non-filers. Next slide. So real briefly, we've issued 13267s for landfills, POTWs for PFAS and PFOA. we're looking to the future now at looking at what compliance with those orders look like and coordinating within the regional board and state board to assess compliance moving forward. And we're coordinating internally with Region 5 in multiple programs, site cleanup, permitting. Quite frankly, we're just now starting to get a group together and lay the plan out moving forward. So I'm excited to see where that goes. Next slide. And then EPA has an environmental justice initiative that we are also very interested in, and they've been looking at geographically based areas. I've listed a few here: Stockton, Pomona, Oakland, LA. Really the task force under EPA in conjunction with State Board, they've been trying to move towards sector-based initiatives where they start globally and then they kind of narrow in. And one of the big things we're looking at are historic concerns from communities that have come to the board before. So that's where we're starting. Next slide. As part of the Environmental Justice Initiative, the EPA and State Board have been looking at 3 categories to kick it off. And the first is metal shredders. That's being led by DTSC. They've only identified 1 facility in Region 5, and that was in Stockton. Composting facilities will be their next charge, and that's going to be led by Cal Recycle. I expect, yeah.
You're talking about metal shredders. It's being led by DTSC. What is this, your needles or what? This is under environmental justice. I'm trying to find the connection.
Okay, great. Yeah, so they're looking at these 3 areas: metal shredders, composting, and oil gas in environmental justice areas. So basically we're trying to protect the public that are more disadvantaged, don't have the resources to come in and argue and stand up for their water quality rights. That's how I see it. So metal shredders, again, the effort's being led by DTSC, but we're participating. We've got 1 facility in Stockton. Composting facilities is being led by Cal Recycle.
I guess my question hasn't been answered. For what are the metal shredders being used?
For what are they being used?
Yes.
They're industrial metal shredders. Sorry. So it kind of encompasses a very large aspect of industrial facilities that would need coverage under the industrial general permit, most likely.
It's usually they'll take appliances and others and essentially shred them into little bits and compact them and then sell them for recycled raw material. Okay. So that's anywhere from autos to appliances to other kind of heavy metal pieces. And the challenge with them is they can generate both aluminum dust and other types of metal dusts, fluff and fines. The aluminum dust can actually explode, so they're fairly risky type of facilities to run. But yeah, these are big industrial machines that are on the metal shredder sites.
Okay, I didn't realize that was an issue for environmental justice. Heavy metals issues that I've seen have been where you've had combustion processes associated with heavy metals where you get high temperatures and then they redeposit, and associated with soil. Lead is one example, but other heavy metals themselves have also been implicated in such things as chrome and so forth. And
yeah, it's a lot of that is the fluff and fines and including stuff like PCBs and stuff like that. So if you have like the dust basically from these metal shredding operations, if it runs off the site in stormwater and then finds its way into bottom sediment on a waterway, that is a huge water quality concern.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And then composting facilities, we have had 9 facilities identified in Kern County that we're looking into with EPA and State Board to make sure that these facilities are permitted and in compliance. And then the last effort will be oil and gas, and that's going to be led by the Air Board. That hasn't made much progress to this point. They're still in their research phase. Next slide. So the statewide industrial stormwater non-filer initiative, Senate Bill 205 became effective January 1st, 2020. Basically, this program is requiring businesses to enroll under the IGP in order to obtain or renew their business license if coverage is necessary. So full IGP coverage generally consists of a stormwater pollution prevention plan, best management practices, and monitoring. But you can also apply and enroll under the IGP under a no exposure certification, which typically means their activities are done indoor and there's no threat to water quality or stormwater being discharged off-site. Industrial stormwater non-filer expedited settlement agreement. This is something that EPA has finalized for nationwide use in September of 2019. Region 5 has been essentially doing the expedited settlement agreement, but we call them expedited payment letters. Very similar, but we're in lockstep. We're moving forward and seeing how we can leverage each other's resources. Next slide. Of course, 2020 was unpredictable. It's been a crazy year. We've got the pandemic and teleworking, COVID-19. We had a lot of requests for regulatory relief, and then the wildfires you've heard about. Next slide. So pandemic-wise, being a new program manager in a pandemic where you have 3 offices has been tough. I think one of the areas I really look forward to focusing on in the future is the coordination of the 3 offices, but with stay-at-home orders, it's been difficult. So just throwing that out there, I expect it to improve. And then, it took time to get staff resourced at home, up and operating. A lot of computers were shared with family, which, that has limitations. And then rural teleworkers, such as myself, we have connectivity issues. So I think at the beginning there was probably an impact on productivity, but I'm really impressed and happy with the way our staff have responded. And then compliance and enforcement managers and staff, I just want to give them recognition that they've been extremely flexible and it's much appreciated. Next slide. So it's the position of the state of California that protection of public health and the environment are essential functions, which is great. So by extension, compliance with water board's requirements and permits are also considered essential functions. Next slide. So the water boards recognize that, there were challenges that the regulated community were going to face, and so we basically got together. State Board formed a team led by Jonathan Bishop and had regional board participation from our region with Alex Mushagan, who has done an excellent job. And they looked at providing a general guidance document for recommendations on specific relief requests. These are not blanket requests. These are site by site, and we look at them with a pretty keen eye, let's say that. So they came up with the recommendations for these COVID-19 requests. And I just want to point out that Region 5, staff receive requests for relief for all programs routinely, whether it's COVID related or not. So we really keyed into if it's COVID related, then we're going to go through this particular process to approve or deny. Next slide. Since February 2020, we've received 62 requests. We've actually received a few more, but some of them have been punted to downtown under, the Division of Financial Assistance and some of the grants and loans programs where they're asking for deferment of payment. But these are the requests we've responded to in Region 5. The requests have been across all programs, no prejudice there. Mostly they're asking for monitoring and reporting delays. To this point, we've approved 50, we've denied 7, and we've got 5 pending. The state board does want to publish these in the near term. We've gotten a lot of requests from reporters and the public about what kind of relief requests we're getting. So stay tuned for that. They may or may not publish these, but there is talk that it is going to happen in the near future. And I just want to say I appreciate all the program managers for keeping the spreadsheet up to date and staying on top of it. Next slide. So, excuse me, here's some wildfire assessment and stabilization. Again, I wanted to have Rich Moll chime in and give him all the credit where credit's deserved and let him speak a little bit to his efforts here, especially with training.
Thank you, Carrie. Angela and JJ did a great job talking about fires. So my role really in the fire has been training. And in an effort to really address the potential issues, we've trained staff in both the Rancho Cordova and Fresno offices. Additionally, we included staff from the State Board of Emergency Management. And the training really involved, it was a field training essentially. And it involved soil burn, looking at soil burn severity, discussing typical conditions after a wildfire, discussing possible ways to stabilize areas impacted by the fire. We discussed the importance of stabilizing structures after the fire, and really especially structures that were lost in areas where they've got a lot of runoff and things of that nature. We also went through a number of assessment sheets. The assessment sheets were developed by the Reading office. These assessment sheets are really comprehensive, and it gives us a good sense of what goes on each site and when we fill those out. So in addition to that, I'm also working with Region 1 on a virtual field class for the statewide debris task force, which meets on a weekly basis. They have both a northern and a southern meeting, and they wanted some additional information on post-fire BMPs. So we're going to do that next week. Our overall goal really in the training is to have multiple staff throughout the region that are trained in post-wildfire assessment and stabilization, are familiar with the assessment forms, are familiar with mapping and other information, can assist each other as needed. So we have we have a number of folks that can do that work. And this will really provide us with a good foundation to support either post-fire assessment and stabilization this year or in the future. I want to specifically talk about the Fresno area because the Fresno area has not had a large wildfire for some time. So we are specifically working with staff from the Fresno office and the Sierra Resource Conservation District to provide training and support. The Sierra Resource Conservation District actually has funding to deploy best management practices in specific areas impacted by the Creek Fire, but they've never really dealt with a wildfire. So we spent Monday and Tuesday of this week training both staff in the Fresno office as well as the Sierra Resource Conservation District staff on potential stabilization efforts. It was a field class again, but I felt like they got a lot out of it. I've got some emails from them. They peppered us with additional questions. So they're very motivated to do a lot and try and stabilize some specific areas of the wildfire. Also, I've been really working with Cal Recycle. I'm providing them technical support in an effort to address statewide program to stabilize structures lost by wildfires. As Angela mentioned, Cal Recycle is responsible for removal of debris from structures destroyed by a wildfire. And Cal Recycle hires contractors to do this work. And not all contractors do it the same way. They're not all equal. So Cal Recycle is trying to take a more statewide approach on how to stabilize structures, particularly given the high number of structures that were impacted this year. So they're trying to come up with a statewide risk-based program that would have certain BMPs deployed. It would be like A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3 type thing, high risk, low, medium risk, low risk. And the contractor would then have some idea what BMPs to put in depending on what the risk was. In addition to that, I'm answering questions, just technical questions, or helping municipalities. I'm helping also state and federal agencies. I'm answering some questions, and some of the utility districts too are basically asking questions, and we're providing some technical support for them. And so we're pretty fully engaged in trying to deal to the extent we can with some of these fires and at least help out on a technical advisory standpoint at this point. And that's all I had on wildfires and stabilization, I think. Next slide.
Thank you, Rich. Very interesting. And as I mentioned before, and I think particularly we saw this, oh gosh, what's the name? Paradise Fire. The buried pipe, particularly the plastic pipe, had to be removed. If they go in and think they can reuse that pipe in some areas, they may find they working with a toxic material. I would presume that they are thinking about buried pipe also when they talk about remediating or stabilizing these structures.
Yeah, they basically pull everything out, including the foundation, and then they do testing to make sure there's no hazardous materials. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much. Carrie, is there anything else?
We're at the very end. Next slide. I know, it's been long.
Oh, here's some photos. I should have gone next slide. Here's some, I'm glad I went to the next slide. Here's some photos of the training. I'll just show these really quick. We're just on the upper left, we're just testing that we're looking at soil burn severity. It's an important thing to look at because it really does impact the runoff that comes off a site, particularly on a steep slope like this. The bottom left, we're actually looking at a structure that was lost. And we not only look at the structure, we're looking at the area around it. You can see if you look in the background here, it's the top of a watershed, but there's a huge amount of runoff that comes onto this facility. So we anticipate potentially this material is going to wash off. There's a creek about 100 yards behind us. The upper right is a dock, basically in Lake Berryessa, that actually what happened, the fire came down, it exploded the actual dock at the gasoline pump, and then burnt the entire floats under the dock, and the dock sunk along with a bunch of boats and some other things. The bottom right is just a restoration project. We're seeing a lot of restoration projects right now, emergency actions to do restoration. This is extensive. This thing goes for miles, and they're putting chevrons in the creek channels. They're doing a bunch of different things to try and capture the sediment because it's going to impact the drinking water in Solano County. So we're seeing a lot of these emergency 401s come through. We're trying to follow up and do some inspections on some of these and just see kind of what they're doing and how they're going about doing it. But when you look at this picture, you can see how incised this channel is anyway. So it had some problems before the fire, but now it's even more damaged. And this is down on the LNU fire. This is close to Vacaville. And that's, I think, our presentation. Sorry.
So I did add, next slide, please, Jean. This is the last slide, promise. So obviously we've had a lot going on this year. Rich, I really appreciate all of your efforts. You've been amazing. I do want to just emphasize that I'm really looking forward to utilizing the strategic planning efforts that you heard about yesterday and hearing from them the feedback about potential improvements, and so look forward to that. Across office communication, the coordinator role that I'm also charged with, it's been a little bit difficult. I'm gonna just say that. We used to have a coordinator, so I've tried to split myself into two people, but really during the pandemic, it's been tough. But I will not give up. And then just continue to review our program efficiencies, needs, and measuring success of enforcement that leads to compliance. This is one thing I've been thinking about for a number of years, is to see, if enforcement has really impacted compliance with our dischargers in our communities. And so I know State Board Office of Enforcement is really interested in this. And so when that effort starts up, I would like to be a part of that as well. Next slide.
That's a new one.
That's it. Yeah.
That's good.
Very good. Okay. Thank you very much. Board members, any comments or questions?
Yeah, Carrie, you didn't know that turning yourself into two people was a part of the job description? No, I'm just kidding.
You know what, honestly, I did know that, and I let them know up front that wasn't possible. So anything I can do above one
she
PY,
said that in the interview, believe it or not.
Oh,
I
really?
did.
Oh, so I just thought that was hilarious. No, I mean, everything you are doing, and especially in this year, is to be commended. And I know I speak for the board when I say we appreciate all your efforts and how much effort you're putting in. And then after saying all that, you're still interested in being part of the strategic planning on doing more work. So thank you for your commitment to the water board. I mean, that's commendable.
Yeah, honestly, if I hadn't gotten the promotion, I would have been on that strategic planning panel as well. So I'm definitely interested in improving wherever we can.
Well, you, and I say this a bit with tongue in cheek, but you're pretty unique when you say you're looking forward to strategic planning. But no, it's a critical function, and it serves if done right, it serves a very important role in the operation of any organization. Those who don't like it don't do it right. So, okay.
I would say right now during 2020 and the time we're in, it's the most important thing, quite frankly.
Right. No, you're right on. Any further comments by board members?
Yeah, I'd just like to comment. It was a great presentation, Carrie. All the challenges that you presented, and there were quite a few because, like you say, these are the times that we're in. But I'm confident with the staff that you have and the process that you've laid out to begin to address some of the issues. I think we will go far. You have an excellent team, and I appreciate your presentation, and we look forward to hearing back from you with some great news.
Thank you.
And let me turn this is Carmen. Oh, this is Carmen. And I think the only thing that I would say is that take it easier on yourself. You seem to think that there wasn't quite enough done, and it's the opposite. Not only were you new and you had two sort of positions that you were taking on, but you've also had COVID and all this other thing. So I think that you should recognize that you did an outstanding job, and you did great on a presentation through Zoom. So I see good things all around. So congratulations, and thanks for the information.
Well, you've dealt with fire, and you've dealt with pestilence. Next would be the three horsemen. So, yeah, I agree. You've done a great job, and the board has done a great job. The board staff, I think, is extremely exceptional. And with that, any further comments or questions? If not, then I'm going to adjourn this meeting and until the 10th and 11th of December for the next regular meeting of the Central Valley Regional Control Board.
All right. Have
Thank
a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Great job, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.